Have you ever wondered why the oldest traces of human life often appear on dry land, when many early people may have lived close to water? If you leave footprints on a beach, the tide does not need violence to erase them, it only needs time. Now imagine that quiet force working for thousands of years along ancient coastlines, where people may have walked, gathered food, made tools, and learned the edges of their world. If the simple picture were true, those first coastal stories should still be waiting clearly in front of us. But that did not happen. After the last ice age, the sea rose, and large parts of the old shoreline disappeared beneath water. The land where some early communities may have lived is no longer land at all. So where is the secret hidden? Beneath shallow seas, under layers of silt, inside caves near vanished coasts, or only in fragments carried inland by memory and migration? Tonight, we begin slowly, because the ocean did not simply destroy the past. It chose what could remain, and that is when the real story begins. 12,000 years ago, what first chapter of human history did the ocean delete? Before the ocean covered the old edges of the world, the coast was not just a border between land and water. For many human groups, it may have been one of the most practical places to stay alive. A shoreline gives the eye a simple shape to follow. On one side there is the open movement of water, changing with tide, wind, and season. On the other side there is land, with plants, stones, animals, wood, shelter, and paths leading inland. To a modern mind, the beach can feel like a place for rest. But for people living near the end of the last ice age, a coast could have been a working landscape. It held food in many forms. Shellfish could be collected from rocks or mudflats in places where they were available. Fish could be trapped, speared, gathered from pools, or caught in ways that varied from region to region. Birds came to cliffs, marshes, and estuaries. Seaweed, driftwood, freshwater streams, and the meeting of river and sea could all matter in the daily search for life. None of this means that every ancient coast was rich, easy, or safe. Some were cold, stormy, dry, or dangerous. Some offered little at the wrong season, but compared with an empty plain or a deep forest that demanded harder tracking, the edge of the sea could offer repeated signs. The tide returned. Shell beds grew in known places. Birds followed familiar rhythms. Fish moved through channels. A person did not need to understand the world through maps to notice that water, mud, rock, and animal movement kept making patterns. This is why the title begins with loss. If many early people learned from coastlines, then the ocean did not only cover ground, it may have covered a school of human attention, a place where bodies learned timing, patience, and return. The beginning of humanity was never separated from water. Long before cities, writing, or farming, our ancestors needed places where thirst could be answered, and food could be found often enough to carry children through another day. Rivers, lakes, springs, wetlands, and shorelines all shaped where people could pause, gather, and move. The coast belonged to that larger human beginning, but it had a special quality. It was a line that could guide movement across distance. Inland travel often required memory of hills, trees, valleys, and seasonal changes. A shoreline gave a long, continuous edge. Follow it in one direction, and the land remained beside you. Follow it in the other, and water remained beside you. This does not prove a single great coastal migration everywhere, and responsible history should not turn a useful possibility into a certain story. But it explains why archaeologists and anthropologists take ancient coastlines seriously. They were not empty margins. They may have been routes, food zones, resting places, meeting places, and repeated homes. When people crossed new landscapes, a coast could reduce confusion. It could provide orientation. It could also create memory. A certain headland, a sheltered bay, a reef that appeared at low tide, a cave above the beach, a river mouth where fresh water met salt water. These are small details, but human life is built from small details repeated for many seasons. A child carried along such a coast would grow up learning not only where food was found, but when the ground became soft, when birds nested, when storms came, and which stones broke well enough to make tools. If such lives happened on land that later drowned, the missing evidence is not a small problem. It changes the shape of the story itself. The oldest human past that reaches us most clearly often comes from places that survived on dry ground, in caves, on high terraces, in deserts, or in sediments protected from later destruction. But coastlines were moving, fragile, and exposed. The places that may have helped people live could also be the places least able to keep their traces. That is the quiet paradox. The shoreline may have been one of the most human landscapes, yet it is also one of the easiest landscapes for history to lose. A coastline can feed people, guide people, and hold people close to fresh water, but it is rarely kind to the marks they leave behind. A cave can protect ash from an old fire. A dry shelter can keep stone flakes, bones, pigments, and layers of floor in a slow stack of time. A desert can preserve footprints when mud hardens and is buried gently. Even a high river terrace can remain above later floods long enough for archaeologists to read it. The coast is different. It is a moving edge. It is never only land and never only sea. Every tide touches it. Every storm can rearrange it. Sand shifts. Mud cracks, softens and fills again. Wind exposes one surface and hides another. Rivers bring sediment down from inland. Then the sea pushes, sorts and spreads it. What looks like a peaceful beach in one season may be cut away in another. For a person living there 12,000 years ago, such movement could be part of ordinary knowledge. For archaeology, it is a problem that reaches into the heart of the human story. The things that make daily life visible are often the things least able to survive. A ring of stones around a small fire can be scattered. Charcoal can be washed away or mixed into younger layers. A hut made of wood, reeds, hides, or branches can vanish almost completely. A sleeping place on sand leaves no monument. A child's small footprint near a tidal pool may last only until the next change in water, wind, or animal movement. Food waste can remain in shell heaps when conditions are right, and shell middens are among the important signs of coastal life in many parts of the world. But even these can be broken, buried, eroded, or drowned. The coast does not erase everything in one simple act. It edits. It keeps hard objects more often than soft ones. It favours stone over fibre, shell over skin, buried layers over open surfaces. Because of that, the people who lived there can become strangely incomplete. Their tools may remain, while their shelters disappear. Their meals may appear through shells and bones, while their roots, fears and skills vanish without a mark. Human origins were shaped by bodies that needed warmth, food, water, rest and social care. But the record of those bodies depends on soil, chemistry, pressure and chance. A life may have been full, repeated and deeply human, yet the ground may leave almost nothing behind. Old coastlines matter deeply to the question of the first deleted chapter. If the earliest pages that survived come mostly from stronger places of preservation, then the story we inherit is not false, but it is uneven. It may overrepresent caves because caves protect. It may overrepresent dry uplands because dry ground endures. It may overrepresent stone because stone outlives almost everything else. Meanwhile, the softer edge where people may have gathered shellfish, watched tides, repaired tools or baskets, carried children, dried fish, and waited out weather could be missing not because it was unimportant, but because it was fragile. The loss is not only about objects, it is about perspective. When a coastline disappears, the relationship between people and landscape disappears with it. We lose the small distances between a shelter and a reef, between a freshwater stream and a beach, between a safe fire and a cold wind coming from open water. We lose the way a group might have planned a day around low tide, or returned to the same cove across many seasons. These are not dramatic scenes, but they are the substance of survival. The beginning of human history was not made only in rare moments of invention. It was made in repeated mornings, ordinary hunger, learned routes, and quiet decisions about where a body could last through the night. Coastal evidence is difficult because it belonged to that moving world. The sea did not need to hate memory in order to remove it. It only needed to keep moving, grain by grain, storm by storm, generation by generation, until the places that held human life no longer looked like places at all. 12,000 years ago, the change did not begin with a single wave. There was no morning when every coastline disappeared at once. No generation woke to discover that the world had suddenly become smaller. Instead, The transformation unfolded slowly enough that many people may never have recognized its full scale during their own lifetimes. At the end of the last ice age, as the climate warmed and great ice sheets gradually melted, water that had been locked in ice returned to the oceans. Over many centuries and millennia, global sea level rose substantially. The exact pace was not the same everywhere. In some places, the shoreline moved only a short distance over many generations. Elsewhere, the combination of rising seas, local land movement, and changing river systems reshaped entire coastal landscapes. This is one of the most important ideas for understanding the earliest chapters of human history. The sea did not simply arrive and erase the past. It slowly redrew the map on which people lived. Imagine a family returning each year to the same stretch of coast. The beach where children once played becomes narrower. A freshwater spring that once stood well inland begins to sit closer to the tide. A familiar sandbar disappears beneath deeper water. A place where shellfish were collected every season produces less than before because the shoreline has shifted. None of these changes alone would necessarily force people to abandon their lives. Human beings are remarkably adaptable. They move camps, change hunting routes, discover new fishing places, and adjust to changing environments. That flexibility has been part of our species for a very long time. Yet when small changes continue across many generations, they eventually become something much larger. A grandparent may remember a broad coastal plain. Their grandchildren may know only a narrow beach. Several generations later, the same place may lie beneath shallow water, invisible except to fish and currents. Human origins were shaped by exactly this kind of long relationship with changing environments. Our ancestors did not live in a frozen world. They experienced shifting climates, advancing forests, retreating grasslands, changing rivers, and moving coastlines. The people themselves changed little from one lifetime to the next, but the landscapes around them could slowly become unfamiliar. This gradual transformation makes archaeological evidence especially difficult to interpret. A settlement abandoned because the shoreline moved inland may later be buried beneath marine sediment. A campsite that stood safely above the waves for hundreds of years may eventually become part of the seabed. Rivers can change course, carrying mud across former living surfaces. Waves can break apart older deposits while burying others beneath sand. The result is that many places where people may once have lived no longer exist as visible landscapes. They survive only as hidden layers beneath modern seas. This does not mean that all early coastal settlements have vanished completely. Some ancient shorelines remain above water because local geological processes lifted the land. Others are preserved in caves that once overlooked the sea. In recent decades, underwater archaeology has also revealed important prehistoric sites beneath coastal waters in several parts of the world. These discoveries remind us that the drowned landscape is not beyond investigation, even if it remains far more difficult to study than dry land. Yet they also remind us how much remains inaccessible. Every archaeological site found beneath the sea requires specialized equipment, careful mapping, and conditions that are often unpredictable. Large areas of the continental shelves around the world remain only lightly explored. This creates an unavoidable imbalance in the human story. We naturally know more about places that survived above sea level than places that did not. The first chapter of human history is therefore incomplete, not necessarily because people avoided the coast, but because the coast itself kept moving until many of its oldest pages lay beneath the water. When we look at a modern map, it is easy to imagine that today's shorelines have always existed. They feel permanent because they have remained familiar throughout our own lives. But 12,000 years is long enough for an entirely different geography to have existed. Much of what now appears to be open sea was once dry ground somewhere in the world. People could have walked there, rested there, raised children there, and remembered those places as home. Today, those landscapes lie beyond the horizon of ordinary experience. The ocean did not simply cover ancient land. It quietly carried away part of the stage upon which some of humanity's earliest daily lives were lived, leaving us to reconstruct that missing beginning from the fragments that still remain. Before the sea rose, the world did not have the same outline it has today. A modern map makes the coast look fixed, as if the edge of land has always been where we now draw it. But near the end of the last ice age, much of the planet's water was still locked inside enormous ice sheets. Because so much water was held on land as ice, global sea level was lower than it is now. This did not create one single lost continent everywhere, but it did expose wide areas of land along many continental shelves. In some regions, the difference between the old coast and the modern coast could be enormous. Plains, river valleys, wetlands, lagoons, beaches, and low hills that are now beneath shallow seas may once have been walkable ground. For human beings living then, this was not an abstract geological fact. It was the shape of the world under their feet, the place where a person could stand, gather shellfish, follow animals, find fresh water, or move from one camp to another was wider than the coastline we see today. The ocean was farther away in many places. Rivers often had longer paths before reaching the sea. Islands that are now separated by water may have been closer to each other or connected to larger land masses in certain regions. This matters because human history begins not with kingdoms or writing, but with landscapes that allowed bodies to survive. A human body needs drinkable water, food, warmth, rest, and other people. It also needs routes through space. The exposed coastal plains of that older world may have offered some of those routes. They were not necessarily easy places. They could be cold, windy, muddy, dangerous, or seasonally poor. But they were real landscapes, and in many places they formed the low edges between inland environments and the sea. If people used them, even occasionally, then part of the first human story unfolded on ground that no longer appears on ordinary maps. This is why the phrase "the ocean deleted the first chapter" must be understood carefully. The ocean did not erase a finished book. It covered parts of the page before we learned how to read them. In the world before the sea rose, shorelines were not just thinner versions of modern beaches. They could include broad zones of life, estuaries where rivers met salt water, marshes where birds gathered, tidal flats where shellfish lived, and river mouths where freshwater, fish, plants, and animals met in one concentrated place. Such places can be important for foragers because they combine different resources in a relatively small area. Again, this does not mean that every ancient coastal plain was rich or densely occupied. The evidence varies, and much of it is hard to recover. But from a biological and anthropological point of view, it makes sense that humans would pay attention to edges where different environments met. Our ancestors were not separate from ecology. They lived by reading it. They watched animal movement, plant seasons, weather, water, tracks, and the behavior of other people. A coastline, especially one with rivers and wetlands, could gather many signs into one place. The tragedy for archaeology is that these same low, useful places were often the first to be transformed when sea level rose. High caves might remain, inland rock shelters might still preserve old ash and tools, but low coastal plains could become bays, straits, seabeds, and submerged shelves. If generations of people lived or moved there before the water returned, their traces may now lie under sand, mud, and waves. Some may have been destroyed. Some may be preserved but hidden. Some may never be found, because the search area is too vast. The beginning of human history, therefore, is not only a question of what people did, it is also a question of which landscapes were allowed to remain visible. 12,000 years ago, people were living through a world that still carried the shape of the Ice Age, while also moving toward the warmer world we know. They did not see the whole transition from above. They saw local places, a camp, a cove, a river, a path, a ridge, a beach, a patch of useful stone, a place where older people remembered food had once been found. Over time, those local places changed. The sea moved into some of them. The map narrowed, and with that narrowing, the human record became uneven, tilted toward the lands that stayed dry and away from the lands that quietly disappeared beneath the water. To understand the world before the sea rose, we have to let go of the modern map for a while. The map we know feels natural because it is the only one we have lived with. Britain is separated from mainland Europe by the North Sea and the English Channel. Australia is surrounded by water. Many islands sit apart from one another as if they were always isolated. Southeast Asia appears as a region of peninsulas, islands, straits, and seas. But near the end of the last ice age, the world beneath human feet was arranged differently in many places. Lower sea level exposed broad shelves around the continents. Some islands were larger, some channels were narrower. Some lands that now appear separate were connected or closer than they are today. The people living in that time did not think of these places as future seabeds. They were simply the ground. They were places to cross, places to follow, places to remember, places where a group might stop because water, stone, plants, animals or shellfish could be found nearby. This is why the lost coastline matters so much. The first chapter of human history was not written on the same planet we imagine when we look at today's shore. It was written on an older geography, one that has partly vanished beneath shallow seas. For people moving through that world, space itself offered different possibilities. A valley that is now underwater may once have guided walking. A river that now enters the sea near the coast may once have continued across a plain before reaching a more distant shoreline. A low ridge now hidden underwater may once have been a landmark. A place that looks today like open sea may once have held camps, animal tracks, freshwater pools, or routes between neighbouring groups. These possibilities must be described carefully, because not every drowned shelf was inhabited, and not every exposed land was useful. Some places may have been harsh, cold, dry, or difficult. Yet from the point of view of human survival, the exposed land still matters. Human beings were never living in abstract time. They were living in local space. A person did not experience global sea level. A person experienced whether the walk to water was long or short, whether the old gathering place still existed, whether the beach had moved, whether a familiar river mouth still held fish, whether the next group was reachable across land or separated by dangerous water. The origin of human history lies in these small bodily facts. Feet followed ground, hands carried tools, children learned paths from adults. Old people remembered places that younger people had never seen in the same way. When the coastline changed, it did not only alter scenery, it altered distance, memory, risk, and contact between groups. A land bridge could make movement easier while it existed, then disappear beneath the sea and turn neighbours into islanders. A broad coastal plain could allow a group to spread out, then narrow until people had to move inland, cluster around remaining resources, or follow the shore somewhere else. A river valley could become an estuary, then a bay. A walking route could become a boat route, or vanish from daily life entirely. These changes did not happen everywhere in the same manner, and they did not produce one simple human response. Some communities may have adapted gradually, some may have moved. Some may have returned seasonally until return was no longer useful. Some may have left no clear evidence at all. This unevenness is important, because it prevents the story from becoming a fantasy of one drowned civilization. What was lost was probably not one single world with one single culture. It was many local worlds, each with its own shoreline, its own food patterns, its own dangers, and its own memories. Across many coasts, the rising sea could remove not only settlements, but the relationships between settlements. A site on dry land may survive, while the lower route that connected it to other places disappears. A cave above the modern coast may still be found, while the open-air camp below it lies underwater. A shell midden may survive on a raised shore in one region, while a similar place elsewhere is broken by waves or buried under marine sediment. This means the archaeological record can give us islands of evidence without the surrounding landscape that made them meaningful. It is like finding a few words from a sentence, while the rest of the page has been soaked and blurred. The words are real, they matter, but the missing spaces also matter. When we ask what the ocean deleted, we are not only asking what objects were lost, we are asking what map of human life disappeared before history could preserve it. The answer begins with this simple but difficult thought. Many early people may have moved, rested, gathered, and remembered places on a version of Earth that no longer exists at the surface. The modern sea is not just water. In many places it is a cover laid over older ground, and beneath that cover may lie roots that once belonged to the first long memory of humankind. Sea level rise after the last ice age is often imagined as a single, dramatic flood. But that picture is too simple for the long human story. In most places, the returning ocean did not arrive like one wall of water that erased the world in a single day. It came as a process, uneven and repeated, measured across centuries and millennia. Ice sheets melted, Oceans expanded, shorelines moved, rivers adjusted their paths. Estuaries grew where valleys had once carried fresh water across dry land. Low plains became marshes, then tidal flats, then bays, then open water. To the people living through these changes, the transformation may have felt less like the end of the world than like a world that never stopped shifting. One generation might notice that storms reached farther inland than before. Another might remember that a certain sandbar had become unreliable. A later generation might no longer use the old campsite because the ground was too wet, too exposed, or too close to the tide. The change was real, but it did not always announce itself as history. It entered daily life as inconvenience, adjustment, and memory. This matters because human beings are adapted not only to survive sudden danger, but also to live inside slow uncertainty. The beginning of our story was shaped by bodies that could walk, carry, watch, remember, cooperate, and revise old habits when the land changed beneath them. A slow sea rise would have tested exactly those abilities. It could turn a familiar coastline into a place of small losses long before it became a drowned landscape. A spring might become brackish. A low path might flood more often. A place where people once slept safely might become damp, then abandoned. A shell bed might shift with the water. A river mouth might become richer for a time, then too wide or too unstable to use in the old way. These are not spectacular images, but they are the kind of changes that matter most to people who live close to the land. Survival depends on returning to what worked before, and sea level rise slowly made some forms of return impossible. Yet the same process could also create new opportunities. A new estuary might attract fish and birds. A flooded valley might become a productive wetland. A group might move a camp inland but continue visiting the shore. Another group might learn new routes along the changing edge. The rising ocean did not only remove, it also rearranged. That is why the story must remain careful. We should not imagine helpless people simply watching the sea take everything from them. Ancient humans were not passive figures in a landscape. They were skilled observers shaped by generations of environmental change. They had already lived through cold, drought, shifting animals, changing plants, and dangerous seasons. Their knowledge was practical, carried in bodies and relationships, rather than written records. Still, adaptation does not mean nothing was lost. A group can survive and still lose places. A family can move and still leave behind the ground where older memories were formed. A shoreline can retreat slowly and still erase a deep record of human presence. Across many generations, this slow movement of water could transform not only where people lived, but how communities related to one another. A coastal plain that once allowed movement between groups might narrow, fragment, or vanish. People who once exchanged stone, shells, partners, stories, or seasonal knowledge across walkable land might find distance increasing between them. In some regions, rising seas helped create islands or stronger separations between populations. In others, they pushed people toward new inland routes or different coastal zones. The archaeological result is difficult to read because the human response was probably not uniform. There was no single ending, and no single migration caused by the sea everywhere. There were many small histories, each tied to local terrain, climate, resources, and memory. The first chapter deleted by the ocean was therefore not a simple scene of destruction. It was a slow thinning of visible evidence. Places were left behind before they were covered. Camps were moved before they were drowned. Routes changed before they disappeared from the map. By the time the modern shoreline took shape, many earlier shorelines had already passed through several lives: dry ground, wetland, tidal edge, shallow sea, and finally hidden seabed. What we call lost history may have been experienced by ancient people as ordinary decisions made under changing conditions. Move the fire higher, sleep farther from the tide, follow the river inland, try the next bay, remember the old place only as something the elders knew. This is why the rising sea is so powerful in the human story. It did not need to erase people to erase part of their world. It only needed time, water, and the slow patience of change. A coast can be more than a place to stop. It can become a path. When people imagine early human movement, they often picture small groups crossing open plains, climbing hills, passing through forests, or following animals inland. Those images are not wrong, but they are incomplete. In many environments, the edge of the sea may also have offered a kind of long road, not built by human hands, but made by the meeting of land and water. A shoreline gives direction without needing walls, signs, or maps. Walk with the water beside you, and the route continues. Turn inland, and you enter a more complex world of valleys, ridges, forests, dry ground, wet ground, and seasonal barriers. The coast does not remove danger, but it can simplify orientation. For people without written maps, and for communities whose knowledge lived in memory, landmarks, stories, and repeated journeys, that simplicity mattered. A headland could be remembered. A river mouth could be recognized. A reef, a bay, a line of cliffs, or a stretch of shell beds could become part of a mental map carried across generations. This is why some researchers have considered coastal movement an important possibility in human prehistory, especially in regions where people may have followed shorelines, rivers, islands, or marine resources across long distances. It should not be turned into a single answer for every migration, because human movement was always shaped by local climates, technologies, population pressures, and choices we cannot fully see. Still, the idea has force because it fits something basic about human bodies. We walk, we remember edges, we return to places that feed us. We teach younger people how to recognize safe routes. Near the beginning of the human story, long before written directions, a shoreline may have served as both a food zone and a guide through space. It could offer fish, shellfish, birds, plants, driftwood, fresh water near river mouths, and stones washed or exposed by erosion. In some places, these resources may have been seasonal, scattered, or difficult to use. In others, they may have been dependable enough to make repeated visits worthwhile. A coast with estuaries and tidal flats can gather many forms of life together, because fresh water and salt water meet, sediments accumulate, and animals follow the changing edge. For a foraging group, this could reduce uncertainty. Instead of searching only across a wide inland landscape, people could move along a line where several kinds of resources might appear within reach. The human mind evolved for this kind of attention. It notices pattern, return, and difference. It learns that low tide reveals what high tide hides. It learns that birds gather where fish gather, that shellfish live in certain rocks or mud, that storms leave driftwood, that river mouths can change after heavy rain. These lessons are not abstract science, but they are knowledge. They are part of the deep beginning of human life, when survival depended on reading the world closely enough to keep a group alive. If coastlines helped some communities move, then the ocean's later rise did more than hide camps. It hid possible corridors of human experience. It covered places where walking, feeding, teaching, and remembering may have been tied together. A route is not only a line on land. It is a chain of known places. One safe beach leads to another. One stream leads to a camp. One ridge above the shore leads to a view of the next bay. People moving through such landscapes would not need to see themselves as explorers in the modern sense. They may simply have followed known opportunities, returned to familiar places, or extended movement slowly as families grew, climates changed, or resources shifted. Over generations, such movements could carry people far without any single person planning a vast journey. This is one reason the drowned coasts are so important. If some of those routes now lie underwater, then the surviving record may make human movement look more inland, more fragmented, or more mysterious than it really was. Dry sites may show us where people ended up, paused, or survived in protected deposits, while the connective tissue between them has vanished beneath the sea. The first chapter of human history may have included coastal highways made not of roads, but of memory, food, and repeated footsteps along land that no longer meets the air. For a small human group moving through an ancient landscape, the coast may have offered something especially valuable, a place where different kinds of food could appear close together. Inland environments could be rich too, and many human groups lived far from the sea with great skill. But a shoreline, when conditions were favourable, gathered several worlds into one narrow band. There was the open water, with fish and marine animals. There were rocks, reefs, mudflats and tidal pools, where shellfish and small creatures could be collected. There were beaches where driftwood might arrive. There were marshes and estuaries where birds gathered, where fish moved in and out with the tide, and where fresh water could meet salt water. There were nearby inland edges with plants, stone, small animals, and sometimes larger game. This does not mean the coast was always easy. Some coasts were dangerous, cold, exposed, or poor in resources. Storms could kill. Tides could trap. Salt water could not be drunk. But where a coastline had fresh water nearby and a mixture of habitats, it could provide repeated opportunities. Repetition is important in human survival. People do not only need food once, they need food again and again, through seasons, pregnancies, childhoods, injuries, and old age. A place that could be revisited, watched, and understood slowly over time could become more than a feeding ground. It could become a memory landscape. Human beings began from bodies that were vulnerable, social, and dependent on learning. A newborn could not survive alone. A child needed adults who knew where food might be found tomorrow, not just today. Coastal places may have supported this kind of knowledge because they were full of returning patterns. Low tide exposed what high tide concealed. Certain shellfish beds could be known. Birds could signal seasonal change. Fish might gather near river mouths or in shallow waters at certain times. People could learn these rhythms through observation, and that knowledge could be passed quietly from older hands to younger ones. In this sense, the coast was not simply a pantry. It was a living calendar. It taught timing. It taught patience. It taught the relationship between hunger and waiting. For a foraging community, that mattered. If inland hunting failed, shellfish might still be collected in some places. If the weather made one activity difficult, another part of the shoreline might offer something else. Such flexibility could reduce risk, though it never removed it completely. This is one reason coastal resources are important in discussions of early human movement. A route that also feeds people is easier to follow than a route that only leads through empty space. A shoreline could let a group move gradually, stopping where conditions allowed, learning each new stretch of land and water without leaving every familiar pattern behind at once. No single person needed to decide to cross the world. Movement could happen by small extensions, a little farther along the coast, another bay, another river mouth, another season of return. Over many generations, those small movements could become long distances. But the evidence for such lives is difficult because many of the most useful coastal zones after the Ice Age were also the zones most likely to be drowned or disturbed. If people gathered shellfish on a tidal flat that later became seabed, the shells might be scattered, buried, or preserved only in places difficult to find. If they used wooden stakes, baskets, nets, or plant fibers, those materials would usually vanish unless protected by unusual conditions. If they camped lightly, leaving only ash, broken shells, stone flakes, and small bones, much of that record could disappear through erosion or marine sediment. So the ocean may have hidden not only where people lived, but how they managed uncertainty. It may have covered evidence of ordinary skill, the knowledge of tides, the choice of safe gathering places, the ability to read birds and water, the quiet planning that allowed a group to survive without farming, storage buildings, or written accounts. This is the deeper reason the first chapter feels missing. It is not only a lost chapter of migration, it is a lost chapter of daily intelligence. The ancient coast may have held a kind of human knowledge that did not need monuments to be real. It existed in repeated walks, in hands opening shells, in children learning when to wait for the water to fall, in elders remembering which shore could feed people when inland food was uncertain. When the sea rose over those places, it did not erase human intelligence itself. But it made some of its earliest traces harder to see, leaving us with a past that may be true, yet still missing many of the quiet skills that helped our ancestors keep moving. Because many ancient coastlines are now underwater, and the idea of a coastal human highway remains powerful but incomplete. It gives us a way to think about movement, food, memory, and survival, yet it also forces us to admit how much is hidden from direct view. If people moved along old shorelines, many of their stopping places may not be on land anymore. A camp beside a vanished river mouth, a shell-gathering place on a drowned tidal flat, a lookout above a former bay, or a sheltered hollow close to an older beach may now lie under meters of water, sand, mud, or broken stone, Archaeology depends on traces that survive in places where people can still find them. When the landscape itself has changed form, the evidence becomes scattered, silent, or difficult to separate from natural processes. A stone tool under the sea may be real evidence, but it must be understood carefully. A pile of stones may be natural. A shell deposit may be made by people, storms, animals, or several forces mixed together. An old river channel beneath the seabed may suggest a once livable place, but it does not by itself prove a camp. This is why the coastal story must be told with patience. It cannot become a fantasy of certainty. The ocean may hide many human traces, but hidden evidence is not the same as known evidence. Responsible history has to walk between two mistakes. One mistake is to say that because many old coasts are drowned, we can imagine anything we want beneath the water. The other mistake is to say that because we have not found enough evidence, coastal life and movement were unimportant. The truth is more careful and more interesting. The missing shorelines create a gap in the record, and that gap changes how we read the beginning of human history. Human origins were shaped by movement through real environments, but the environments that survive archaeologically are not a perfect sample of the environments people used. Dry caves speak more loudly because they preserve. Open coasts may speak softly because they were exposed, drowned, or erased. That does not make the cave evidence wrong. It makes the whole picture uneven. A person living 12,000 years ago did not know that one place would preserve their fire and another would lose it. They lived where survival made sense. They followed water, food, stone, shelter, and other people. If a coast offered those things, it could become part of their world even if it later became invisible to ours. This difficulty also affects the way we think about migration. A surviving inland site may appear isolated on a modern map. It may seem as if people arrived there by a route we cannot explain. But if the old coastline was farther out, and if now drowned plains, rivers, and estuaries connected different areas, then the ancient map may have offered paths that no longer exist. The silence of the sea can make human movement look more mysterious than it was. What appears as a sudden arrival in the dry record may have been the end of a long, gradual movement across landscapes that were later submerged. This does not solve every question. It does not tell us exactly who moved where, or when, or how often. It simply reminds us that modern geography can mislead the imagination. We are trying to reconstruct human journeys from a map that has lost some of its roads. The earliest human story may have included many coastal steps that left only faint marks, or none that we have found yet. A group might have moved from bay to bay for generations. Children might have learned shorelines their descendants would never see. People might have exchanged stone, shells, stories, mates, warnings, and techniques along edges now buried under the sea. These possibilities matter because they belong to ordinary human life, not to myth. They do not require a lost empire or a forgotten advanced civilization. They require only people doing what people have always done, finding food, remembering places, caring for one another, and moving when the ground beneath life changed. The first chapter deleted by the ocean may therefore be less like a vanished monument and more like a missing route. It may be the connective tissue between known sites, the daily path between water and shelter, the repeated return to a shore that no longer exists. When we look at the evidence that remains, we should listen not only to what is present, but also to the shape of what is absent. The sea has made the early human record harder to read, and that difficulty is not a weakness of the story. It is part of the story itself. When the ocean covers an old human place, it does not treat every trace in the same way. It does not simply take a camp and preserve it whole beneath clear water, like a room sealed behind glass. A shoreline is a zone of pressure, movement, salt, sand, mud, and living organisms. Before a place becomes fully submerged, it may pass through many forms of disturbance. Waves cut into soft banks. Storms pull away layers of sand. Wind exposes a surface, then buries it again. Rivers bring silt from inland and lay it over older ground. Tides push water into cracks, pools, and low hollows. Salt changes the chemistry of bone, wood, fibre, and ash. Small animals burrow. Shellfish attach to hard surfaces. Plant roots grow, die, and loosen sediment. Later, after the sea has moved farther in, currents can sort what remains by size and weight. Light objects may be carried away, heavy objects may stay but lose their original position. Sharp flakes of stone may survive, while the soft handle that once held a tool disappears. A hearth may leave charcoal in one layer, but if that layer is broken and mixed, the story becomes harder to read. This is why coastal archaeology is so delicate. The question is not only whether something survived, it is whether it survived in a way that still allows us to understand its place in human life. A stone flake found where it was made can speak differently from a stone flake moved by water. A shell heap left by repeated meals can speak differently from shells gathered by waves. A patch of dark soil may be an old living surface, or it may be a natural deposit changed by water and time. The ocean does not always destroy evidence. Sometimes it buries evidence deeply enough to protect it. Sometimes mud seals a surface away from oxygen. Sometimes underwater sediments preserve wooden objects better than dry land would have done. But those cases depend on special conditions. More often, the coast creates a mixed record where preservation and destruction happen together. For the earliest human story, that mixed record is both a warning and an invitation. It warns us not to read every underwater object as proof of human activity. It also invites us to remember that much real human activity may have left only broken, shifted, or hidden traces. Human origins were never lived as clean layers in the ground. They were lived by warm bodies making temporary choices in unstable places. People slept on sand, cooked near wind, carried tools from one shore to another, left fish bones and shells, repaired things, moved on, returned, and forgot small details that mattered only for a season. The ground recorded some of this by accident, not by design. Then the ocean began editing that accident. It may have removed the lightest pages first. Footprints, matting, baskets, wooden stakes, skin coverings, small hearths, sleeping hollows, temporary windbreaks, traces of children playing near water, marks of knees and hands in wet sand. Heavier traces had better chances, but even stone can lose context. If water rolls a tool from the place where it was dropped, its meaning becomes less certain. If a storm breaks a shell midden and spreads it across a beach, the repeated human visits behind it become harder to see. If marine sediment buries an old camp under meters of sand, the evidence may survive but remain unreachable. This is what the ocean does to evidence. It changes the relationship between object and place. It can keep the object while erasing the scene. It can leave the material while removing the pattern. It can preserve a fragment while hiding the life that gave the fragment meaning. The first chapter of human history may therefore be missing not because nothing happened, but because the physical world chose unevenly. Caves kept floors. Dry uplands kept stone scatters. Some inland sediments kept bones. The coast, where people may have watched tides and read food from the edge of water, often kept only what could endure motion. The result is a past that reaches us in pieces, with many of its softest and most ordinary human moments washed, buried, or scattered before anyone could name them history. The things most likely to vanish from an ancient coast were often the things closest to daily life. A stone tool can survive because stone is stubborn. A shell can survive because its mineral body resists time better than skin, wood, or woven plant fiber. But the ordinary structures of human living were usually made from materials that belong to the living world. Branches, reeds, grasses, bark, hide, cordage, bone, antler, wooden posts, leaves, fibers, and soft earth. These materials were practical because they were close at hand. They could be repaired, replaced, carried, reshaped, and abandoned. For people moving along a shore, that made sense. A shelter did not need to last 1,000 years. It needed to block wind for a night, keep rain from a child, hold warmth near a fire, or give shade while food was prepared. A basket did not need to become evidence. It needed to carry shellfish, plants, tools, or gathered fuel. A wooden stake did not need to impress the future. It needed to hold something in place. Yet archaeology depends heavily on what can endure. This creates a strange imbalance. The objects most important to survival may be the least visible after thousands of years. Near the beginning of human history, bodies lived among perishable things. Hands tied knots, shaped wood, Softened skins, lifted sleeping mats, carried infants, gathered grasses, and made temporary spaces habitable. When such life took place near a coast, the chance of disappearance grew even stronger. Salt water breaks down many materials. Wetting and drying can split wood and bone. Oxygen feeds decay. Insects, microbes, roots, burrowing animals, waves, sand, and storms all work on what people leave behind. A footprint on damp sand can be clear for a moment, then gone before the next day. A shallow hearth can be scattered by wind or tide. Fish bones can be crushed. Small bones of birds or mammals can disappear into sediment, be eaten by animals, or become too fragmentary to identify. Even human burials near shorelines can be disturbed by erosion, rising water, or shifting ground. This does not mean nothing soft ever survives. In waterlogged, oxygen-poor, frozen, extremely dry, or rapidly buried conditions, organic materials can sometimes remain for extraordinary lengths of time. But those are not normal conditions everywhere. They are exceptions that show us what may usually be missing. The coast, especially an open and changing coast, tends to be a poor keeper of light traces. What disappears includes not only objects, but evidence of behavior. A shelter made of reeds might tell us how people understood wind. A wooden fish trap might reveal knowledge of tides and animal movement. A woven bag might show the importance of carrying and storage. A sleeping surface might show where people protected their bodies from cold ground or wet sand. A cluster of small hearths might show repeated visits by families, not just one brief stop. When those traces vanish, the remaining record can make ancient life appear simpler than it was. We may see stone flakes and shells and imagine a rough life reduced to tools and meals, but the real human world was almost certainly fuller. It included gestures, skills, materials, and spaces that rarely fossilize. This matters directly to the lost coastal chapter. If many early coastal communities used perishable technology, then the ocean may have removed the very evidence that would make them visible as complex human beings. A group could know how to bind fibers, set traps, mend nets, shape poles, prepare food, organize sleeping spaces, care for children, and manage risk along the tide, while leaving behind only a few hard fragments. The beginning of our species was not only stone. Stone is simply what has the best chance of reaching us. Human life began in bodies that needed softness as much as sharpness. Something to carry, something to cover, something to sleep on, something to wrap, something to tie, something to shield skin from wind. The first chapter erased by the ocean may therefore have contained many things that were never meant to be permanent. It may have been written in materials that belonged to seasons rather than centuries. A fire that kept one group warm could vanish. A child's path to a tide pool could vanish. A small shelter above the beach could vanish. A set of wooden tools could vanish. The ocean did not need to destroy great buildings to change history. It only needed to erase the fragile equipment of ordinary survival, leaving the harder pieces behind and making the people who used them look quieter, poorer, and more distant than they really were. Some traces disappear quickly at the coast, but others can survive with surprising patience. The ocean is not only an enemy of evidence. Under the right conditions, it can also become a cover. Mud can seal a surface. Sand can bury a tool before waves break it apart. Shell can remain after softer food waste has vanished. Stone can endure long after the hand that shaped it is gone. In sheltered places, sediments may protect old layers from oxygen, animals, and later disturbance. In caves near former coastlines, ancient floors may preserve ash, bones, shells, pigments, and stone tools. On raised shorelines where land has lifted or the sea has moved away, old coastal deposits can remain above the modern water. In rare underwater settings, wooden objects and organic materials may even survive better than they would have on dry land, especially when buried in low-oxygen sediment. These exceptions are important because they prevent the story from becoming too simple. The ocean did not delete everything. It selected, transformed, hid, and sometimes protected. What survives often depends less on how important something was to people, and more on whether the material could resist chemistry, pressure, movement, and time. A stone tool dropped near a camp might last. A wooden handle attached to it might vanish. Shells from repeated meals might form a midden that survives for thousands of years. The sleeping mats, baskets, cords, and windbreaks used by the same people might disappear without a visible trace. A cave above an old beach might keep evidence because its roof protected the floor. The open-air camp below that cave might be gone, drowned, or mixed beyond recognition. This is how the record becomes uneven. It is not a clean window into the past. It is more like a shoreline after the tide has moved through it. Some shapes remain clear, others blur, and many are gone before anyone arrives to look. The surviving traces can still be powerful. A shell midden can show repeated use of coastal food. Fish bones, when preserved, can reveal what people ate, and sometimes how they used local waters. Stone flakes can show tool making, movement of raw materials, and repeated visits to particular places. Charcoal, if preserved in a reliable layer, can help identify fire use and sometimes provide dating evidence. Sediment itself can speak. Layers of sand, mud, pollen, microfossils, and marine shells can help reconstruct whether a place was once dry land, wetland, beach, lagoon, or shallow sea. These details may seem quiet, but they are the language left after the louder parts of life have disappeared. They help archaeologists rebuild the old edge of the world one fragment at a time. Yet every fragment must be handled carefully. A shell deposit is not automatically a human meal. A stone underwater is not automatically a tool. A dark layer is not automatically a hearth. The deeper the past goes, and the more a place has been disturbed by water, the more patient the interpretation must become. This caution does not weaken the story. It makes the story more truthful. Human origins were shaped by real bodies in real places, and real places leave imperfect evidence. To understand the first coastal chapter, we have to accept both sides at once. Some evidence has survived, and much may be missing. The hardest part is that what remains can make ancient people look more limited than they were. If only stone, shell, and bone survive, then the vanished world of fibre, wood, skin, sound, teaching, and memory becomes easy to forget. But people did not live only in the materials that endure. They lived in arrangements, where the fire sat, where children slept, where food was cleaned, where tools were repaired, where elders watched the tide, where paths led inland, where fresh water could be reached. A surviving shell heap may be the last hard sign of a much larger social space. A few stone flakes may be the remnant of a camp where many skills were used but not preserved. A cave with coastal remains may be only the visible upper edge of a broader landscape now hidden beneath the sea. This is what the ocean leaves us. Not silence alone, but a difficult kind of speech. It gives us shells without the hands that gathered them, tools without the full camp, sediments without the voices that once crossed them. The first chapter of human history was not erased into nothing. It became broken, buried, and selective. The task is not to imagine wildly what lies beneath the water, but to read the surviving traces with enough humility to know that the missing parts may be just as important as the pieces we can hold. Not every human life leaves a clear mark in the ground. This is one of the most important truths behind the lost coastal chapter. When people think of the deep past, they often imagine archaeology as a record of discovery, as if every group that mattered left behind a visible site waiting to be found. But many communities lived lightly. They did not build stone walls. They did not carve permanent monuments. They did not write names into clay or cut kings into rock. They made shelters from what the landscape gave them. They moved when food, weather, water, or social needs required movement. They repaired tools, gathered food, warmed children, watched the sky, and slept near places that made survival possible for a little longer. A group could live for generations near a coast and still leave only thin evidence. A scatter of stone flakes, broken shells, a darkened patch of soil, small bones, or nothing that can be confidently separated from natural change. This does not make their lives less important. It only means that archaeology is not equally fair to all kinds of people. The beginning of human history was made mostly by ordinary communities, not by the builders of large things. It was made by people whose greatest achievements were often repeated survival, shared knowledge, and the ability to keep a small group alive through unstable seasons. Along a coast, those achievements may have been quiet and practical. Knowing when the tide exposed food could matter more than building something permanent. Remembering which stream stayed fresh during dry weather could matter more than leaving a large structure. Knowing where to sleep above storm reach, where to find driftwood, where shell beds were safe, and where the ground became dangerous underfoot could shape a whole way of life. Yet such knowledge rarely becomes a strong archaeological object. It lives in behaviour, teaching, and memory. When the sea rose over the places where that knowledge was practiced, it did not need to erase a city. It could erase a pattern. It could cover the small spaces where human intelligence was used every day without ever becoming monumental. This is why the people of the drowned coast can be so hard to see. They may not be absent from the past. They may be absent from the surviving record. The distinction matters. If we only trust what is easiest to find, human history becomes biased toward caves, dry lands, stone tools, and durable refuse. Those are real sources of knowledge, and they are precious. But they are not the whole human world. A cave can preserve a layer of ash, while the open beach below it loses the place where fish were cleaned. A high terrace can preserve stone flakes, while the lower wetland where plants were gathered lies beneath marine sediment. A shell midden may survive in one place, while another group doing something similar nearby leaves no preserved mound at all. The result is a record that can make some people appear vivid and others almost invisible. The invisible ones may have been mothers carrying infants along the shore, old people teaching tide patterns, young adults learning how far to move before dark, children following footprints in damp sand, and skilled hands making objects from wood, fibre, shell, bone and stone. Most of these lives did not aim toward permanence. They aimed toward tomorrow. That aim is deeply human. In the earliest chapters of our species, survival was not a simple matter of strength. It depended on shared attention, memory, care, and repeated decisions in specific landscapes. A coast could hold all of that, yet leave almost nothing behind once water, sand, salt, and time had passed through it. So when we ask what the ocean deleted, we should not imagine only lost artifacts. We should imagine lost visibility. Whole communities may have slipped out of the record not because they were rare, simple, or unimportant, but because they lived in places where history was written on soft ground. The first chapter of human history may therefore be filled with people we almost cannot see. Not legendary people, not advanced hidden civilizations, but ordinary human groups whose daily lives were real enough to shape the future and fragile enough to disappear beneath the sea. The most basic parts of ancient life are often the hardest to recover. Eating, sleeping, warming the body, carrying children, repairing tools, choosing where to rest, deciding when to move, these were the daily acts that kept people alive. Yet most of them left weak traces, especially near the sea. A meal of shellfish might leave shells if they gathered in one place and if later waves did not scatter them. A fish meal might leave bones, if the bones were not crushed, eaten by animals, dissolved or washed into a different layer. A fire might leave ash and charcoal if the hearth was protected quickly enough. But a night of sleep on sand, grass, reeds or skins could vanish completely. A place where a tired body lay down after walking along the coast would not necessarily leave anything that could be found 12,000 years later. This is important because the first chapter of human history was not made only by hunting, migrating and making tools. It was also made by rest. A human body cannot keep moving without sleep. A child cannot grow without care. A group cannot survive only through dramatic moments. It survives through ordinary repetition, finding enough food, staying warm enough, avoiding danger, and waking again in the morning. Near an ancient shore, those acts may have happened in small camps that shifted with weather, tide, season, and memory. People may have slept above the reach of waves, near driftwood, near freshwater, behind dunes, in shallow caves, under light shelters, or beside fires protected from wind. Some of those places may have been used briefly. Others may have been returned to many times. Yet unless the conditions were unusually good for preservation, the traces would be faint. A few stones, a patch of charcoal, a scatter of shells, perhaps a tool broken and left behind. From that, we try to imagine a whole night. The difficulty is not only technical, it changes the feeling of the past. When evidence is thin, ancient people can appear as shadows who only hunt, eat, and move. But they were full human beings with vulnerable bodies. They felt cold, hunger, fear, fatigue, and attachment. They had to protect infants who could not walk far. They had to help injured members of the group. They had to choose ground that was dry enough, safe enough, and close enough to resources. These choices were not separate from human origins. They were the origin of human life, as a social life. A baby carried near a shore depended on adults who knew where the tide would reach. An older person with experience could remember which camp flooded in storms, which hollow stayed damp, which ridge caught too much wind, and which stream could still be used when salt water moved inland. Such knowledge may have mattered as much as the sharp edge of a tool, but it rarely survives as an object. Tool repair is another quiet act that often disappears into fragments. A person sitting near a fire might reshape a stone edge, bind a tool, mend a basket, fix a spear, or prepare material for the next day. Stone flakes can survive, but the posture, patience, and teaching around them vanish. The same is true of food preparation. Cleaning fish, cracking shells, roasting small animals, sharing meat, gathering plants, drying food in wind, or carrying leftovers away from camp could leave scattered remains that later seem small. Yet for the people living there, these acts were the center of the day. If the ocean later covered the place, the loss is not only a missing campsite, it is a missing rhythm of life. We lose where people sat, where children watched, where tools were passed from hand to hand, where older knowledge entered younger bodies. The first deleted chapter may therefore contain the most human evidence of all, not monuments, but arrangements of care. A sleeping place near a coast, a small hearth above a beach, a repaired tool beside shells, a path from camp to fresh water, a child's movement between adults. These are the kinds of traces that make a community real, and they are exactly the kinds of traces the sea can erase most easily. What remains may be enough to prove presence in some places, but not enough to restore the tenderness, difficulty, and intelligence of daily survival. The ocean did not only hide where ancient people went, it hid how they endured the ordinary weight of being alive. When evidence disappears unevenly, the past begins to lean toward the places that were lucky enough to survive. This leaning is quiet, but it changes everything. A dry cave can become a doorway into ancient life because it protects layers from rain, waves, and constant movement. A rock shelter can preserve ash, tools, bones, and the slow build-up of repeated visits. A high terrace can remain above the sea and keep traces that would have been destroyed lower down. These places become visible to archaeologists, and because they are visible, they begin to shape the story. But visibility is not the same as importance. A place that preserves well can speak loudly even if it was only one part of a larger life. A place that preserves poorly can fall silent even if people return there often. This is one of the deepest problems in reading the first human chapters. The record does not simply show us where people lived, it shows us where time allowed evidence to remain. If many coastal camps, routes, and gathering places were drowned or disturbed, then the surviving story may make ancient life appear more inland, more cave-centered, and more stone-centered than it really was. That does not make the surviving evidence false, it makes it partial. Human history begins not as a complete picture, but as a set of fragments shaped by geology, chemistry, erosion, and chance. A cave above an old coast might preserve a fire, while the beach below it loses the daily work that made the fire meaningful. An inland site might show where people made tools, while the drowned shore may have held the food sources that helped support them. A dry valley might keep bones, while a former wetland under the sea may have held plants, birds, fish, and pathways that linked groups together. If those lower landscapes disappear, the remaining evidence can pull our imagination upward and inland. We may begin to think that the preserved places were the main places, when they may have been only the surviving edges of a broader world. This matters for the origin of human life, because our ancestors did not live according to what would preserve best. They lived according to need. Bodies needed water, calories, shelter, warmth, social contact, and routes through changing land. A place near a river mouth, lagoon, or tide flat might have served those needs well for generations and still leave little behind. Meanwhile, A cave used less often might preserve more clearly because stone walls and dry floors protected it. The archaeological record, then, is not a fair memory. It has preferences. It prefers hard materials. It prefers protected spaces. It prefers places not later cut away by water. It often prefers the unusual survival of things over the ordinary importance of things. To read it honestly, we have to notice this bias. The ocean's deletion of the first chapter is not only a physical loss beneath water, it is also an interpretive loss inside our minds. When evidence from one kind of landscape survives more often, we may unconsciously build a story around that landscape. We may give more weight to what we can hold, and less weight to what conditions destroyed. Yet the missing coastal world may have shaped food strategies, movement, social contact, and memory in ways that never became permanent objects. A group might have spent part of the year inland and part near the sea. If the inland camp survives and the coastal camp vanishes, we see only half a rhythm. A tool made on dry land might have been carried to the shore, used there, and lost there. If the shore is gone, the tool's full journey disappears. A shell ornament found far inland might hint at coastal connection, but the beach where the shell was gathered may be lost beneath waves. The past becomes a conversation in which one speaker is louder because the other has been muffled. This is why caution is not weakness. It is a form of respect for the people we almost cannot see. They may have lived in places where evidence was never meant to last, and where the sea later made lasting even harder. The first chapter of human history may not be missing because it was empty. It may be missing because the people who lived it stood too close to moving water, built too lightly, carried too much in memory, and left behind a world that the ocean was always going to change. What remains on dry land is precious, but it is not the whole beginning. Beneath the modern sea, and inside the gaps between known sites, there may be the outline of a human world that was ordinary, coastal, skilled, and deeply important, even if history now hears it only as silence. Memory is often imagined as something that lives only inside the human mind. We think of stories told around a fire, names passed from one generation to the next, or old people describing places that younger people have never seen. But long before writing, memory also lived in the landscape itself. A familiar hill reminded people where to turn. A bend in a river marked the way to fresh water. A line of cliffs signaled that shellfish could be found below at low tide. A solitary tree, an exposed rock, or the shape of a distant headland could become part of a mental map carried not on paper but in repeated experience. Every journey reinforced that map. Every successful return made it more reliable. For early human communities, remembering a place was rarely an abstract exercise. It was closely tied to survival. The place where fish appeared after certain winds, the spring that remained fresh during dry weather, the sheltered beach where storms were less dangerous, the narrow crossing where a river could be passed safely. These were memories with physical consequences. They were learned through the body before they were ever spoken aloud. A child walking beside older relatives would gradually connect stories with real places. The landscape itself became a teacher. 12,000 years ago, however, many coastal landscapes were changing. The change was often slow enough that no single generation experienced a complete transformation. Yet it was steady enough that knowledge had to adapt. A family might return to a familiar shoreline and notice that the tide reached a little farther inland than it had before. The stream where fresh water had always been collected might begin to taste slightly different near its mouth. A patch of ground that once stayed dry through the season might flood after unusually high tides. None of these observations alone would seem like the end of a world. They would simply become another lesson added to memory. But when those small lessons accumulated over many generations, they gradually rewrote the map carried inside human minds. The origin of humanity was never only about learning new things. It was equally about deciding which old knowledge could still be trusted. Every generation inherited experience from those who came before, yet they also had to compare inherited memory with the world in front of them. If the coast moved, memory had to move with it. A grandfather might point toward the sea and say that the shoreline had once been farther away. A grandmother might remember gathering shellfish where waves now rolled across open water. Young people listening to those stories would not necessarily doubt them. They would simply know a different version of the same place. The memory remained, even when the ground had disappeared. This gradual shift reveals something important about human adaptation. We often imagine survival as responding to immediate danger, but many of the greatest challenges faced by prehistoric people unfolded too slowly to be noticed in a single lifetime. The rising sea was one of those challenges. It asked communities not only to move camps or find new food sources, but to revise their understanding of home itself. Home was no longer fixed. It became something that could drift across generations. A path remembered by one generation might no longer exist for the next. A familiar landmark might stand farther from the shore or disappear entirely beneath the water. The memory of a place could outlive the place itself. Archaeology rarely finds such memories directly. It finds shells, bones, stone tools, charcoal, sediments, and occasionally footprints. Memory leaves almost no physical trace unless it becomes attached to something durable. Yet memory may have been one of the most valuable resources ancient people possessed. Without written maps, every safe route, every seasonal camp, every freshwater spring, every dangerous crossing had to be carried in living minds. When landscapes changed, those mental maps had to change as well. The ocean therefore altered more than geography. It altered the relationship between people and memory. Some knowledge could still be transferred. Some had to be abandoned. Some survived only as stories about places that younger generations would never see with their own eyes. If the first chapter of human history now feels incomplete, part of that incompleteness may come from this invisible loss. The sea did not only cover campsites and pathways, it slowly separated memory from the land that had originally created it, leaving later generations to remember places that existed only in words. While the waves quietly erased the ground beneath them, a coastline can disappear from the ground long before it disappears from people. When a place has been used for many seasons, it does not vanish from memory the first time water reaches it. People may continue to speak of it, point toward it, avoid it, return near it, or compare new places to it. A beach that was once a gathering place may become a shallow bay. A freshwater spring near the shore may turn brackish or be covered by sediment. A low path between camps may become wet too often, then dangerous, then impossible. Yet the memory of that path can remain inside the group. Older people may remember where it ran. Younger people may hear about it as something that belonged to the time before the shore changed. In this way, rising water can create a strange division between lived space and remembered space. The body walks through the present landscape, but the mind carries an older one. This matters deeply for the first chapter of human history, because before writing, people stored geography in speech, practice, and repetition. A safe camp was remembered because people returned to it. A shell bed was remembered because it fed people more than once. A dangerous crossing was remembered because someone had been hurt there, or because older people warned younger ones away from it. These memories were not decorative. They helped communities survive. When the sea began to cover old lowlands, some of those memories would lose their practical use, but not necessarily their emotional weight. A place could stop being reachable and still remain meaningful. A person could remember gathering food where water now spread too deep. A family could remember a camp where a child had been born, even after storms made it unsafe. A group could carry the name of a river mouth after the river had widened into an estuary or bay. Human origins were shaped by this ability to carry the absent inside the present. We are not only animals of immediate reaction, we are animals of remembered places. We can compare what is gone with what remains. We can teach younger people about ground they may never stand on. Along a changing coast, this ability may have helped groups adjust without losing continuity. If a shoreline moved inland, people could shift camp and still preserve knowledge of nearby resources. If an old route flooded, they could remember its direction while seeking another. If a familiar place disappeared, its memory could help explain why the group now lived somewhere else. But the same ability also means that the ocean may have deleted more than physical evidence. It may have turned once practical knowledge into stories whose original landscape was no longer visible. Over generations, details can change. A remembered camp becomes a place beyond the water. A former plain becomes a lost ground. A dangerous flood becomes a warning. A vanished path becomes a story of separation. We have to be very careful here. It would be irresponsible to claim that every flood story or memory of a lost land comes directly from the sea level rise after the Ice Age. Oral traditions are complex. They can preserve environmental memory, moral teaching, local history, spiritual meaning, and later events all at once. They change as people retell them. They do not function like geological reports. Still, from an anthropological point of view, it is reasonable to understand that people who experience changing coasts could remember those changes in cultural forms. The point is not to force every story into one scientific explanation. The point is to see that landscape change does not end when the water arrives. It continues inside memory, language, movement, and identity. The ocean could cover a beach, but people might still carry the beach as part of who they were. They might remember where ancestors had lived, where food had once been found, where a crossing had once existed, or where the edge of the world used to be. Archaeology can rarely recover this directly. It may find a drowned surface, a shell deposit, a tool or sediment, showing that the sea moved inland. It cannot easily recover the voice of an elder telling a child that the water was not always there. Yet that voice may have been one of the main ways the lost coast survived for a while. The first chapter of human history was not deleted in a single moment. It faded through a long conversation between land, water, and memory. Some places disappeared physically, some remained as warning, some became part of root knowledge, some became stories, some were forgotten when the last person who knew them died. This is one of the quietest forms of loss. Not the loss of a monument, but the loss of a remembered world when no living mind can still connect the story to the ground beneath it. It is tempting to connect every ancient flood story to the end of the Ice Age. The idea feels powerful because the world really did change. Seas really did rise. Lowlands really did disappear. People really did live through shifting coasts, changing rivers, flooded valleys, and shorelines that moved across generations. But a careful story must not turn that real environmental history into a simple explanation for every myth, memory, or sacred text. Human cultures tell flood stories for many reasons. Rivers overflow, storms destroy villages, tsunamis strike coasts, monsoon systems change, lakes rise and fall. Communities use water as a symbol of danger, cleansing, punishment, renewal, or the fragile boundary between life and death. A story can hold memory, meaning, warning, and imagination at the same time. It may remember a local flood, express a moral lesson, describe a seasonal danger, or combine many older experiences into one form that can be passed on. This is why the question must remain open and slow. The ocean's rise after the last ice age may have left deep impressions in some coastal communities, but we should not claim direct links where evidence is uncertain. What we can say more safely is that humans are capable of remembering environmental change, especially when that change affects food, home, travel, and survival. A coastline moving over generations could become part of inherited knowledge. A drowned plane could become a story of lost ground. A dangerous crossing could become a warning. A place that older people remembered as land could become, for younger people, a place beyond water. Human origins were shaped by this ability to hold time inside memory. We do not live only in the present surface of the world. We inherit instructions, fears, roots, and meanings from those who came before us. Before writing, this inheritance had to be carried by voice, gesture, ritual, repeated travel, and the emotional weight of remembered places. If the sea slowly took parts of the old coast, the loss may have entered memory before it vanished from speech. Yet memory is not a fossil. It changes when it is told. It can compress many events into one. It can move a story from one place to another. It can preserve the feeling of danger while losing the exact date, the exact shoreline, or the exact cause. Over centuries, a practical warning about water can become a deeper story about the world itself. This does not make the story useless. It simply means it must be read differently from sediment, bone, or stone. Archaeology and oral tradition are not the same kind of evidence. One works through material traces, the other works through meaning carried by people. Both can matter, but they cannot be forced to say more than they can support. For the lost coastal chapter, this distinction is essential. The ocean may have deleted camps, routes, and gathering places, while human memory preserved only fragments of what those places meant. those fragments may not survive in a form that science can easily test. They may be changed, blended, or lost entirely. Still, the possibility reminds us that history is not only what lies in the ground, it also once lived in voices that are gone. A person sitting near a fire could tell younger listeners that the water had once been farther away, that a certain bay had once been grassland, that a reef had once been a hill, that a crossing had once joined two places now separated by sea. Whether such a story survived for 10 generations or disappeared after 2, it was part of the human response to a changing world. The first chapter of human history was therefore vulnerable in 2 directions. The land could be covered, and the memory could fade. A tool might remain without its root. A shell heap might remain without the name of the place. A story might remain without the physical shoreline that first gave it shape. Over time, the connection between evidence and memory can loosen until both become difficult to read. This is not a failure of ancient people. It is the normal cost of deep time. We are looking across thousands of years at communities that did not write, often lived lightly, and sometimes occupied landscapes that no longer exist above water. The careful lesson is not that every flood story proves a drowned world. The careful lesson is that real drowned worlds existed, and some people may have remembered them in ways we can no longer fully recover. Between the seabed and the story, between sediment and voice, there is a quiet space where part of the first human chapter may have survived for a while, then slowly passed beyond reach. Beneath the modern sea, there are maps older than the coastlines we know. They are not maps drawn by human hands, but landscapes remembered by geology, drowned river valleys, submerged plains, ancient deltas, old beach ridges, and shallow continental shelves that once stood above water when sea level was lower. To a person looking out from today's shore, the ocean may seem like a clean beginning, a place where land simply ends. But in many parts of the world, the seabed near the coast was once part of the walking world. It may have held grasslands, wetlands, forests, lakes, rivers, dunes, and shorelines that shifted as climate changed. This does not mean that every shallow shelf was filled with people, or that every drowned plain hid an important settlement. History must stay careful, but the existence of those landscapes changes the way we imagine early human life. A modern coastline is only the latest edge of a much older story. The land did not always stop where it stops now. For early communities, these exposed shelves may have offered roots, resources, and places to pause. A broad lowland could connect regions that are now separated by water. A river valley now drowned could once guide movement toward the sea. A wetland at the edge of an older coast could attract birds, fish, plants, and animals. A gentle plain might make travel easier than rugged inland terrain. Human origins were shaped by such practical geography. People moved through what their bodies could cross, what their children could endure, what their older members could remember, and what the land offered from season to season. They did not move through the world as it appears on our maps. They moved through the world that existed then. This is why continental shelves matter so much to the question of the deleted first chapter. Around many coastlines, the shallow seabed is not just empty space beneath water. It is former land, and former land can hold the possibility of former life. The key word is possibility. We should not fill the underwater world with invented certainty, but we should also not ignore it simply because it is hard to study. In some regions, submerged landscapes have already shown that ancient people used places now beneath the sea. In other regions, the evidence remains sparse, partly because underwater research is difficult, expensive, and limited by visibility, sediment, currents, and the huge scale of the search area. The silence of the seabed is not the same as proof that nothing happened there. It is often a silence created by depth, distance, and the difficulty of looking. When a river valley is drowned, the old relationship between people and freshwater may be hidden. When a coastal plain is submerged, the route between inland shelter and marine food may disappear from view. When an ancient lagoon becomes seabed, the record of repeated visits may be buried under layers that modern eyes cannot easily reach. The ocean, in this sense, did not only cover isolated camps, it covered whole settings in which camps made sense. A single site on dry land can look lonely when the surrounding landscape has vanished. A tool found inland may seem disconnected from the sea when the sea was once farther away and the tools maker may have moved through a broader coastal world. A cave near the present shoreline may once have overlooked a plain, not a beach. The view from that cave, the distance to food, the route to fresh water, and the meaning of the place may have been entirely different. To read early history well, we have to restore those missing spaces in the imagination, not by inventing details, but by remembering that the physical stage has changed. The first chapter of human history was lived on landscapes that were later edited by climate and water. Some of those landscapes remain under shallow seas, holding perhaps only fragments, perhaps nothing recoverable, perhaps traces still waiting beneath sand and mud. What matters is that the modern map is not the original page. It is a later version with many low edges covered over. Beneath the water may lie old ground where human feet once followed rivers, watched birds, found shellfish, crossed plains, and learned the shape of a world that has since disappeared from the surface. One way to understand the missing coastal world is to look at regions where the old map is especially different from the modern one. These examples should be used carefully, not as proof of one hidden civilization, but as reminders that the human past was shaped by geographies that no longer exist above water. In northwest Europe, the area often called Doggerland is one of the clearest examples. During periods of lower sea level, land connected what is now Britain to mainland Europe. This was not just a narrow bridge in the imagination. It included broad lowlands, rivers, wetlands, and places where animals and people could have moved. Over time, as seas rose after the last ice age, this landscape became smaller, wetter, more fragmented, and eventually disappeared beneath the North Sea. Today, fishing nets, seabed surveys, and underwater research have helped reveal that a real prehistoric landscape once existed there. The lesson is not that Doggerland explains all of human history. It does not. The lesson is that a place can be part of ordinary human space for thousands of years, then become invisible on the surface of the modern world. To people living then, it was not a lost land. It was simply ground, water, marsh, river, path, and memory. Farther south and east, the old geography of Southeast Asia offers another powerful example. During lower sea levels, large areas of what is now the Sunda Shelf were exposed, connecting or bringing closer parts of present-day mainland Southeast Asia and the islands around it. The modern region appears as sea broken by islands, but the older landscape could include wide lowlands, river systems, and coastal zones very different from the map we know. This matters deeply for thinking about human movement, because Southeast Asia has long been a region of islands, crossings, shorelines, and ecological variety. Early people moving through such a world would have encountered not the modern pattern alone, but changing combinations of land and water. Some routes may have been easier at certain times. Some places now separated by sea may once have been linked by exposed ground or narrower crossings. Yet again, caution is needed. We should not imagine the exposed shelf as one simple highway used everywhere in the same way. Tropical environments, rivers, forests, coasts, and local climates would have shaped movement unevenly. Human origins did not unfold across empty maps. They unfolded through thick, specific environments. People had to find food, avoid danger, care for children, and remain connected to others. The exposed Sunda landscape may have offered possibilities, but those possibilities would have been lived locally, one river, one shore, one season at a time. Around Australia, the question of vanished coasts is also important. The first people reached Sahul, the larger Ice Age landmass that included Australia and New Guinea, long before 12,000 years ago. Lower sea levels meant that the coastlines and distances between lands were different from today, although water crossings were still involved. Much of the evidence for early coastal life may now be underwater because the ancient shore was farther out. This matters because people in Australia developed deep and long relationships with changing landscapes, including coastal regions, inland deserts, rivers, and seasonal environments. When sea levels rose, some older coastal places were submerged, and the record we see today may again be only part of a larger human geography. Similar questions appear around many continental shelves: the Persian Gulf Basin, parts of the Mediterranean, the coasts of the Americas, the shelves around Africa, and many island regions. Each place has its own timing, geology, and evidence. They cannot be collapsed into one story, but together they teach a steady lesson. The modern sea often covers land that once shaped human possibility. The first chapter deleted by the ocean was probably not a single chapter in one place. It was many chapters, written along many old edges of the world. Some may have been brief, some may have lasted for generations, some may have left traces, others may have vanished completely. What connects them is not a dramatic mystery, but a quiet fact. Early humans lived on a changing planet, and the planet did not preserve every place equally. Doggerland, Sunda, Sahul, and other drowned shelves remind us that the map beneath the sea is not empty. It is a memory of older ground, where parts of the human story may have unfolded beyond the reach of ordinary sight. Each drowned shelf has to be read as its own place. It is easy to imagine the ocean hiding one grand secret, one lost world, one missing civilization that would explain everything if only we could reach it. But that is not the careful story. The more truthful possibility is quieter and wider. Beneath different seas lie different landscapes, formed by different rivers, climates, animals, coastlines, and human choices. Doggerland was not the same as Sunda. Sunda was not the same as Sahul. The Persian Gulf Basin, the Mediterranean shelves, the Atlantic coasts, the drowned margins of islands, and the shallow seas around many continents each had their own histories. Some may have supported long-term human use. Some may have been crossed only occasionally. Some may have been harsh or unstable. Some may have held rich wetlands and river mouths. Some may have preserved traces. Others may have been broken apart beyond recognition. The ocean did not delete one identical chapter everywhere. It deleted many local pages. That is why the missing coastal past should not be treated as a single hidden empire beneath the sea. There is no need for that idea to make the loss meaningful. Ordinary human worlds are already enough. A small group returning to a river mouth for shellfish across many seasons is history. A family moving inland after a camp becomes too wet is history. A route between two communities, later cut by rising water, is history. A shelter above an older beach, a place where fish were cleaned, a path to fresh water, a reef known by memory, a low plain where animals crossed. These do not need towers or kings to matter. The first chapter of human history was mostly made from small worlds like these. If the ocean covered many of them, then it removed not a single spectacular story, but an enormous number of ordinary connections. This is harder to imagine because ordinary things do not announce themselves loudly. They vanish without leaving myths of greatness. Yet they are the true fabric of human survival. The beginning of our species was not built from monuments. It was built from repeated decisions made by bodies that needed food, safety, warmth, care, and direction. Each coast offered those needs differently. In one place, a wetland might have drawn birds and fish. In another, a rocky shore might have offered shellfish. Somewhere else, a river delta might have changed too quickly to preserve much of anything. A cold northern plain, a tropical shelf, a dry island margin, and a sheltered bay could all become part of the drowned human record, but none should be forced into the same pattern. This local diversity is important because it protects the story from becoming false. The phrase, "the ocean deleted the first chapter," is powerful only if we understand what it really means. It does not mean the ocean erased one advanced beginning that archaeology refuses to see. It means the conditions of preservation removed many early contexts in which ordinary people lived and moved. The loss is not less profound because it is ordinary. In fact, it may be more profound. The hidden chapters may contain the small-scale human realities that large discoveries often miss. How people used edges, how they timed return, how groups stayed connected, how children learned landscapes that would later disappear, how memory survived after ground was gone. These are difficult to prove in detail, but they are grounded in what we know about foraging life, environmental change, and the uneven survival of evidence. A drowned coast is not a blank fantasy. It is an old environment whose traces must be tested carefully. Some sites may be found, some may never be found. Some may be recognized only through sediment, old channels, submerged forests, shells, stone tools, or the shape of the seabed. The important thing is to keep the scale human. Beneath modern water, there may not be one lost answer. There may be countless partial answers, each tied to a place where people once stood at the meeting of land and sea. When we look at the modern ocean, we are not only looking at water. In many places, we are looking at a cover over former ground, and that ground may have held histories too small to become legend, yet too important to ignore. Finding a lost coast begins long before anyone enters the water. Archaeologists and geologists first have to ask where the old shoreline might have been. The modern beach is only the latest edge, not the original one. To look for the older edge, researchers study the shape of the seabed, the slope of continental shelves, old river channels, layers of sediment, fossil shells, submerged forests, coastal caves, raised beaches, and the chemical signs left by changing environments. A drowned human place cannot be understood by diving at random into the sea. The ocean is too wide, too deep in some areas, too cloudy in others, and too full of natural stones, shells, and sediments that can look meaningful at first glance. The search begins with landscape. Where would fresh water have been? Where would an old river have crossed the exposed shelf? Where might people have found stone for tools, shelter from wind, access to shellfish, fish, birds, plants, or roots inland? These questions matter because ancient people did not live anywhere simply because land existed. They lived where bodies could survive. They needed drinkable water, food, warmth, materials, and contact with others. So the search for a lost coast is really a search for old human possibility. A line on a sea level model can show where the shore may have been at a certain time, but a shoreline alone is not enough. Researchers also look for places where preservation might have been possible. A former lagoon sealed by mud may be more promising than an exposed rocky surface broken by waves. A submerged cave near an old coast may preserve layers more safely than an open beach. A drowned river valley may hold sediment that records the transition from dry land to wetland to sea. In this work, geology becomes a kind of slow memory. Sand, mud, pollen, microfossils, shells, and chemical traces can help rebuild the setting in which humans may have lived. Sometimes the evidence begins with maps made by sonar, showing old channels or landforms beneath the water. Sometimes it begins with cores taken from the seabed, narrow columns of sediment that preserve layers in order. Sometimes it begins on dry land, in a cave or raised shoreline that shows how the coast once stood in relation to human activity. The beginning of human history is therefore studied not only through tools and bones, but through the old shape of land itself. If the ocean deleted part of the first chapter, the first task is to reconstruct the page it was written on. This is careful work, because the underwater world is full of misleading shapes. Nature can break stone in ways that resemble tools. Waves can gather shells in ways that resemble human refuse. Currents can move objects away from their original place. Tree roots, animal burrows, mineral deposits, and erosion can create patterns that look intentional but are not. For that reason, archaeologists need context. A single object is rarely enough. They look for patterns, repeated stone flakes made in recognizable ways, hearth remains in a secure layer, shells associated with other human traces, cut marks on bone, tools near old living surfaces, or sediments that show a stable ground surface where people could have stood. Dating is also essential. A site must be placed in time, not only in space. Radiocarbon dating, other dating methods, and environmental reconstruction help determine whether a layer belongs to the period being studied or to a later disturbance. This caution may feel slow, but it is what keeps the story honest. The lost coast is already powerful enough without invention. It does not need false certainty. What it needs is patient reconstruction. When researchers search for a drowned shoreline, they are not simply looking for treasure underwater. They are trying to understand how a human world became a marine landscape. They ask where the rivers went, where the shore moved, where people could have walked, where evidence might have survived, and where it was likely destroyed. Every old channel, every buried beach ridge, every sealed layer of mud may help restore a little of the missing stage. The ocean may have covered the first chapter, but it did not remove every clue. It left hints in sediment, shape, chemistry, and scattered objects. Reading those hints requires humility, because the sea keeps its evidence unevenly. But even a faint trace can change the way we understand the beginning, reminding us that part of the human story may still lie beneath the quiet surface of modern water. Even after researchers identify a promising underwater landscape, the real challenge has only begun. Working beneath the sea is unlike excavating on dry land. On land, archaeologists can walk across a site, observe its broader layout, return day after day, and uncover each layer slowly enough to understand how the evidence fits together. Underwater, almost every part of that process becomes more difficult. Visibility can change within minutes as currents stir fine sediment from the seabed. A diver's movement alone may cloud the water so completely that nearby features disappear from view. Strong tides may shorten the amount of time a team can work safely. Storms and rough seas can delay an expedition for days or even weeks. In deeper water, every dive is limited by safety requirements, making careful excavation much slower than many people expect. Each movement has to be deliberate, because removing sediment too quickly can destroy the relationships between objects that allow archaeologists to understand what really happened there. Those relationships are often more valuable than the objects themselves. A stone tool lying beside an ancient hearth tells a different story from the same tool moved hundreds of meters away by currents over thousands of years. This is why underwater archaeology is not simply about finding artifacts. It is about recovering context. Technology has transformed this work, but it has not removed its uncertainty. Modern sonar systems can map the shape of the seabed in remarkable detail. Remote-operated vehicles can explore places that are too deep or dangerous for divers. Autonomous underwater vehicles can travel across large areas, creating detailed images of drowned river valleys, ancient shorelines, submerged ridges, and former lake basins. These technologies help researchers narrow the search, but they cannot answer the most important question by themselves. A sonar image cannot tell whether people once gathered there. An unusual pattern on the seabed may represent an ancient campsite, or it may be nothing more than a natural rock formation shaped by thousands of years of erosion. Every promising discovery must therefore be tested through additional evidence. Researchers compare underwater landforms with geological records, examine sediment cores collected from the seabed, study fossil pollen and microscopic organisms that reveal past environments, and investigate whether any artifacts remain in the positions where people originally left them. Human origins demand this level of patience because ancient people did not arrange their camps for future excavation. They built shelters where shelter was needed, gathered food where food was available, and moved when conditions changed. Most camps were probably occupied for short periods before people returned somewhere else. After they left, nature continued working. Wind covered surfaces with sand. Rivers deposited new sediment. Rising seas flooded the land. Marine organisms burrowed through older layers. Waves shifted stones, shells, and bones. Thousands of years later, archaeologists must separate those natural processes from the traces of human behavior. That separation is rarely simple. A concentration of shells may look like the remains of repeated meals, but currents can also gather shells naturally. Broken stones may appear to be tools until closer examination shows they fractured without human involvement. A dark layer beneath the seabed may resemble an ancient hearth until chemical analysis reveals it formed through entirely natural causes. Because mistakes are possible, archaeologists rely on many independent lines of evidence before reaching conclusions. A site becomes convincing not because of one remarkable discovery, but because geology, dating methods, sediments, artifacts, environmental reconstruction, and spatial relationships all point toward the same interpretation. This careful approach explains why underwater archaeology progresses more slowly than many people imagine. It is not a search for spectacular treasures hidden beneath the sea. It is a patient effort to rebuild landscapes that disappeared thousands of years ago. Large areas of the continental shelves around the world remain only lightly explored, not because researchers believe they contain nothing, but because the search itself is technically demanding, expensive, and enormously time-consuming. The silence beneath the water should therefore be understood carefully. It is not proof that ancient people never lived there. More often, it reflects how difficult those drowned landscapes are to investigate. The first chapter of human history may still rest beneath shallow seas, but reading it requires extraordinary care. Every sediment core, every sonar survey, every underwater excavation, and every cautiously interpreted artifact adds only a few more sentences to a story that the ocean made far harder to read. The work continues because each carefully verified discovery reminds us that beneath today's quiet waters lies not an empty world, but the altered remains of landscapes where human lives once unfolded in ways that modern maps can no longer show. Because the underwater record is difficult, it changes the way we should think about absence. On dry land, if many surveys have covered an area and no trace appears, researchers may begin to speak more confidently about what was probably not there, though even then caution remains necessary. Beneath the sea, absence is more complicated. A drowned coastal plain may stretch across a vast area, covered by sand, mud, vegetation, rocks, and modern marine life. Visibility may be poor, sediment may be thick. Older surfaces may lie buried below younger layers. Currents may have moved artifacts away from where people left them. In some places, the ancient ground may have been destroyed by wave action before it was sealed. In others, it may be preserved so deeply that no ordinary survey can reach it. For this reason, a lack of evidence from submerged coastlines does not always mean a lack of human presence. It may mean the right place has not been searched, or that the evidence lies too deep, or that the traces are too faint to recognize with confidence. This is one of the central lessons of the Lost Coastal chapter. Human history is not preserved evenly, and the sea makes that unevenness more extreme. A group could live near a river mouth for many seasons, leave fires, shells, tools, wooden objects, sleeping places, and paths, and still become almost invisible if the later ocean scattered, buried, or covered those traces. Another group living in a dry cave far inland might leave a clearer record after only a few visits. The difference is not necessarily the importance of the people or the richness of their lives. It is preservation. The beginning of humanity must therefore be read, not only through what survives, but through the conditions that allowed survival. This is why archaeologists often combine many forms of evidence when they study vanished coasts. They do not rely only on spectacular underwater finds. They use sea level models to estimate where coastlines once stood. They study sediment cores to see whether a place was once dry land, marsh, lagoon, river, or sea. They examine pollen, shells, microfossils, and chemical signals to reconstruct the old environment. They compare submerged landforms with nearby dry land sites. They ask where fresh water would have flowed, where stone could be found, where animals may have moved, and where people could have lived safely. Sometimes this work reveals direct human evidence. Sometimes it reveals only a landscape that was suitable for human life. Both kinds of information matter, but they are not the same. A suitable landscape is not proof of occupation. A missing artifact is not proof of absence. Between those 2 points lies the careful middle ground where truthful history has to stand. The ocean deleted the first chapter not by making it impossible to study, but by making every sentence harder to verify. This difficulty should not make us careless. It should make us more precise. When evidence is limited, we should speak in possibilities, probabilities, and patterns, not in invented certainty. It is reasonable to say that many old coastal landscapes are now underwater. It is reasonable to say that some of those places could have been attractive to human groups because they offered water, food, roots, and varied resources. It is reasonable to say that some traces may be hidden, disturbed, or lost, but it would not be responsible to claim that every drowned shelf held dense settlements, or that the sea hides a single missing origin of civilization. The real story is quieter and more grounded. Early people lived on a planet whose coastlines were changing. Some of the places they used are now beyond ordinary view. The evidence that remains is uneven. The task is to recover what can be recovered, and to leave space for what cannot yet be known. This careful attitude brings us closer to the truth, not farther from it. Human origins were not simple, and the record of them is not complete. The silence under the water may contain absence, destruction, preservation, or undiscovered traces, and we often cannot know which one until the work is done. That is why the first chapter feels both near and distant. It is near because it may lie beneath shallow seas, along old rivers and former shorelines not far from modern coasts. It is distant because water, sediment, time, and uncertainty stand between us and the lives once lived there. The ocean did not remove the human past from existence. It moved part of it into a place where every answer must be earned slowly. What the ocean deleted was not only a shoreline, it was a map of daily life. When old coastal plains disappeared beneath rising water, they may have taken with them the physical arrangement that made early human survival understandable. A campsite does not stand alone. It belongs to a pattern of nearby places: fresh water, dry ground, stone sources, shell beds, fishing spots, plant areas, animal paths, shelter from wind, routes inland, and safe places to return before dark. If only one piece of that pattern survives, the life around it becomes harder to see. A cave preserved above the modern coast might show fire, bones, shells, and tools, but the old beach, wetland, or plain below it may now be underwater. Without that lower landscape, the cave can look more isolated than it once was. An inland tool scatter may seem far from the sea today, while 12,000 years ago the shoreline may have been much farther out, with a whole stretch of usable land between. A river mouth now drowned may once have connected fresh water, fish, birds, plants, and movement into one human setting. When such places vanish, archaeology can lose not only objects, but relationships. This is the first kind of deletion, the loss of spatial meaning. Human origins were shaped by bodies moving through connected places. People did not live in dots on a map. They lived in distances. They knew how far a child could walk, how long it took to reach water, where the wind was strongest, where smoke would blow, where the ground stayed dry, where food could be found at low tide, where stone could be collected, and where another group might appear along the shore. These distances were part of intelligence. They were not written down, but they were learned through feet, eyes, hunger, weather, and repetition. If the sea covers the ground between known sites, then it covers the connective tissue of human life. We may find the remaining dots, but the lines between them are gone. A shell midden without its full shoreline is like a sentence missing its verbs. It tells us people ate there, returned there, or used the place in some repeated way, but it may not show how the site fit into the wider rhythm of the day. Was it near a sleeping place? Was it visited only in one season? Did people gather there while moving along a longer route? Was it connected to a freshwater source now buried under sediment? Did it sit beside a lagoon that no longer exists? These questions matter because human life is made from relationships between places. The ocean may have deleted exactly those relationships. A vanished Bibean, a former estuary, a drowned marsh, a low ridge, a sheltered cove, a path along a river valley, each could have served as a small but crucial part of a larger human pattern. None of them needed to become a monument. They only needed to help people survive. When they disappeared, the record of survival became thinner. This is why the lost first chapter is not simply about finding more artifacts. It is about restoring the old geography around the artifacts we already have. A stone tool is more meaningful when we know where the raw material came from, where it was used, what food sources lay nearby, and what route may have carried it from one place to another. A hearth is more meaningful when we know whether it stood near a beach, behind dunes, beside a wetland, or at the mouth of a river. A campsite is more meaningful when we can see the landscape that made camping there sensible. Rising seas often removed those settings. They transformed living landscapes into seabeds, and in doing so, made early human decisions look more mysterious than they may have been. The first chapter deleted by the ocean may therefore have been a chapter of arrangement, where people slept in relation to water, where they gathered food in relation to shelter, where they crossed in relation to tides, where they returned in relation to memory. These are not dramatic losses, but they are deep ones. Without them, the past becomes a set of surviving fragments instead of a lived world. The ocean did not need to erase every tool or every bone to damage the story. It only needed to cover the spaces between them. What the ocean may have deleted was not only where people lived, but what they knew how to do there. A coastline is not useful simply because food exists near it. Food near water often requires timing, skill, caution, and memory. Shellfish may be exposed only when the tide falls. Fish may move through channels at certain moments. Birds may gather seasonally. Driftwood may arrive after storms. Fresh water near the coast may be safe in one place and brackish in another. A reef can feed people, but it can also cut feet, trap the unwary, or become dangerous when water rises. A mudflat can offer food, but it can also hold a body in soft ground. To live well along such an edge, people needed more than hunger. They needed knowledge. They needed to learn when to wait, when to move, when to return, and when to stay away. This kind of knowledge is difficult for archaeology because it often does not become an object. A stone tool may survive, but the timing of its use does not. A shell midden may remain, but the careful reading of tide and weather that made the gathering possible may disappear. A fish bone may show what was eaten, but not the full skill behind catching it. The beginning of human history was full of these invisible skills. Long before farming, writing, or cities, human beings survived by reading environments closely. They knew animal behavior, plant seasons, water sources, dangerous ground, useful stone, and the needs of the group. Along a coast, this intelligence may have included a detailed awareness of tides, currents, shorebirds, reefs, estuaries, storms, and the changing edge between land and sea. If the places where those skills were practiced are now underwater, then the evidence for the skills themselves becomes much harder to recover. This is a different kind of deletion. It is not the loss of a camp, but the loss of a practice. It is not the loss of a single tool, but the loss of the setting that explains why that tool mattered. In some regions, coastal life may have included fishing, shellfish gathering, use of boats or rafts, knowledge of islands, and movement along waterways, though the timing and evidence vary widely from place to place. We should not claim that all early coastal people used the same methods, or that every drowned shore held the same kind of technology. But it is reasonable to say that water-based environments encourage specific forms of attention. A person who lived near tides had to understand time differently from someone living far inland. A group that crossed channels or used coastal routes had to understand risk, distance, weather, and return. A community that gathered marine food had to know which species were safe, where they appeared, and how they changed with season. These skills could be taught without writing. They could pass through demonstration, repeated journeys, warnings, gestures, and stories tied to place. A child might learn by following adults to a shore at low tide, by watching how shells were opened, by being told which pools were dangerous, by seeing how elders chose the moment to leave before water returned. None of this needs to look dramatic. It is ordinary learning. But ordinary learning is what keeps people alive. When the ocean rose over old coasts, it may have hidden the landscapes where early generations developed and refined such knowledge. The result is that some parts of human intelligence become underrepresented in the surviving record. Stone tool-making appears clearly because stone remains. Cave occupation appears clearly because caves protect layers. But fishing techniques using wood, fibre, nets, traps, lines, baskets, or simple watercraft may vanish unless preserved in exceptional conditions. Even when the skill was real, its material trace may have been too soft, too scattered, or too exposed to survive. This can make ancient people seem less connected to the sea than they may actually have been. It can also make movement across coastal regions look harder to explain, because the practical knowledge that made such movement possible is missing. The first chapter deleted by the ocean may therefore include a history of skill, reading tides, collecting safely, moving along water, using coastal resources, and teaching younger people the behavior of a world that changed every day. These are not small matters. They are part of what made humans human. Our species did not survive only by having large brains in a general sense. We survived because knowledge could be shared, corrected, remembered, and adapted to local places. A coast demanded that kind of intelligence. It rewarded patience, observation, and timing. If those coastal lessons were later covered by water, then the ocean did not erase human ability. It erased some of the earliest classrooms where that ability may have been practiced, leaving us with the hard remains of tools and shells, but not always the living knowledge that once moved between hand, tide, and memory. The ocean may also have deleted the lives of people who were never going to become famous in the archaeological record. This may be the deepest loss of all. When we speak about early history, it is easy to focus on the first tool, the oldest site, the earliest migration, the most surprising discovery, or the place that changes a timeline. These things matter, but they can quietly pull attention away from the ordinary communities who carried human life forward without leaving a dramatic mark. Most people in the deep past did not build monuments. They did not found cities. They did not write down their names. They lived in small groups, raised children, shared food, learned local landscapes, repaired what broke, cared for the sick when they could, and moved when staying became too difficult. If some of those communities live near coasts that are now underwater, then the ocean may have removed the evidence of people whose importance was not in greatness, but in continuity. They were the humankind itself. A mother watching a child near a tidal pool, an older person remembering a safer route, a young adult learning how to read the wind, a group returning to the same shell bed after many seasons, a family carrying tools inland when the shore became less reliable. These are not events that usually survive as clear evidence, yet they are the substance of human history. The first chapter of our species was not written mainly by exceptional individuals, it was written by generations of ordinary survival. This is why the drowned coast matters so much. It may have taken away the record of people who were already difficult to see. A stone monument can stand against time. A coastal camp, made of reeds, skins, branches, fire ash, shell and memory cannot. If such a camp is later flooded, scattered and buried, the people who lived there may disappear almost completely from the story. Not because they were unimportant, not because they lacked intelligence, but because their lives were made from materials and places that time did not protect. Human origins depend on these unseen people. Every later society, every language, every tool tradition, every route across land and water came from countless generations whose names are gone. Many of them may have lived without leaving evidence we can easily recognize. This should make us more humble when we speak about the beginning. The surviving record is not a complete list of who mattered. It is a small selection of what endured. A cave site can preserve a trace of human presence and become a famous point on the map. A drowned camp nearby may have supported the same people, or their relatives, or earlier groups, and yet remain unknown. A shell ornament found inland may suggest contact with the coast, while the coastal community that first gathered the shell has vanished from view. A tool tradition may appear in dry places, while the daily settings where those tools were used have been covered by the sea. The result is a history where some people stand in the light because their landscape survived, while others remain in shadow because their ground disappeared. The ocean may therefore have deleted a history of normal human dignity. It may have hidden the record of people who never needed to be kings, inventors, or builders to matter. They mattered because they kept knowledge alive. They mattered because they carried children through changing weather. They mattered because they remembered where water could be found and where danger waited. They mattered because they connected one generation to the next. When the sea rose, it did not erase their existence, but it did make their existence harder for us to prove. This difference is important. The past is larger than the evidence. We should not fill the missing space with fantasy, but we should not mistake the missing space for emptiness either. The first chapter deleted by the ocean may have been filled with people who looked very much like the core of humanity itself. Vulnerable bodies, shared food, learned places, quiet fears, practical intelligence, and care passed forward in small acts. Their world may never return fully to the surface, but when we study the drowned coasts with care, we are not only searching for lost objects. We are trying to make room in history for the ordinary people whose lives were real, even when the sea left us almost nothing to hold. The first lesson of the drowned coast is that history is not only shaped by what people did, it is also shaped by what the earth allowed to remain. This may sound simple, but it changes the way we understand the beginning of the human story. When we look at the deep past, we often treat surviving evidence as if it were a fair record. A cave with tools becomes important because we can study it. A dry shelter with ash becomes meaningful because its layers stayed in place. A stone tool found on land becomes part of a map because it remained visible or recoverable. These traces are real, and they deserve careful attention, but they are not a complete mirror of ancient life. They are the portion of ancient life that passed through the filter of preservation. Many other places may have mattered just as much, or even more in daily survival, yet left fewer signs because water, erosion, decay, or later sea level rise removed them from view. The ocean's deleted chapter reminds us that the past is not democratic in what it saves. It favours stone over wood, dry caves over open beaches, high ground over low plains, sealed layers over exposed surfaces, and lucky accidents over ordinary importance. Human origins were lived by bodies in landscapes, but the landscapes that remain readable today are only a selection. This means that every reconstruction of early human life must hold two truths at once. First, we must respect the evidence we have. We cannot invent lost worlds simply because they are exciting. A missing coastline does not give permission to create false certainty, hidden empires, or dramatic claims without support. Second, we must remember that lack of evidence is not always lack of reality. A drowned camp may be harder to find than a dry cave. A wooden tool may vanish where a stone flake remains. A route along a former river mouth may disappear while one inland stopping place survives. If we forget this, we risk confusing preservation with importance. The first chapter of human history may therefore be less complete than it appears, not because scholars have ignored it, and not because the truth is being hidden, but because time itself has worked unevenly. This is an educational lesson as much as a historical one. It teaches us how to think about evidence. A responsible mind does not fill every gap with imagination, but it also does not pretend the gaps are meaningless. It asks why the gap exists. It asks what kind of material survives. It asks which environments protect traces and which destroy them. It asks whether the map has changed since the lives being studied. This way of thinking makes the human story more honest and more humble. The people of the early coasts, if they lived on lands now submerged, were not less real because their camps are difficult to find. Their footsteps, fires, meals, fears, roots and memories may have vanished as physical traces, but the possibility of their lives remains grounded in what we know about human dependence on water, food, movement and social care. A person 12,000 years ago did not choose a campsite because it would preserve well for future archaeology. They chose it because a child needed rest, because food could be found nearby, because the wind was lower behind a dune, because fresh water was close enough, because the group remembered that place from another season. Those choices are the true beginning of history. They are small, practical, and deeply human. The ocean may have covered many of the places where such choices were made. It may have left us with fragments from higher, drier, harder landscapes, while the softer edge of life remained beneath the tide. So the first part of the final answer is not a claim that we know exactly what was lost. It is a clearer way of seeing what survives. The past we hold is real, but it is not whole. Every artifact is both a message and a survivor. Every missing coastline is both a gap and a reminder. The first chapter was not simply gone. It became harder to read because the page itself changed shape. The second lesson of the drowned coast is that silence is not the same as emptiness. It is natural to look at the modern sea and imagine that nothing important ever existed beneath its surface except rocks, sand, and marine life. After all, the water seems permanent. It stretches to the horizon with an appearance of timelessness. Yet the history of our planet reminds us that permanence is often an illusion created by the brief span of a human lifetime. The coastline that feels ancient to us is only the latest version of a landscape that has been changing for hundreds of thousands of years. 12,000 years ago, many people stood where waves now roll. They watched rivers flow across plains that are now submerged. They followed shorelines that no longer exist. They raised children in places that cannot be visited without diving beneath the sea. None of this requires extraordinary speculation. It follows naturally from what geology, archaeology, paleoclimate research and anthropology have gradually revealed about the end of the last ice age. The educational value of this realization reaches beyond prehistory. It reminds us that the evidence available to us is always filtered by the physical world. Every historical document, every archaeological site, every fossil, every artifact has survived not only because humans created it, but because the environment allowed it to endure. Fire destroys libraries, earthquakes bury cities, rivers change course, forests grow over abandoned settlements, glaciers grind landscapes into new forms, the sea slowly covers old coastlines. Nature is not trying to preserve history, nor is it trying to erase it. It simply follows physical processes that continue whether humans are present or not. Our understanding of the past must therefore remain flexible enough to recognize this reality. The beginning of humanity is not hidden because researchers have failed to look carefully. It is hidden because deep time itself is selective. Some chapters remain almost intact. Others survive only as scattered sentences. Some have disappeared so completely that we may never know exactly what they contained. This should not lead to frustration. Instead, it offers a different way of appreciating the work of science. Archaeology is often imagined as the discovery of spectacular objects, but much of its greatest value comes from patient reconstruction. A few grains of pollen can reveal an ancient landscape. Tiny marine organisms preserved in sediment can show when the sea entered a valley. The chemistry of a shell can help reconstruct past environments. A line of stone flakes can reveal repeated human activity, piece by piece. Researchers rebuild a world that no longer exists in its original form. This slow method mirrors the way the ancient world itself changed. Just as rising seas transformed coastlines gradually, understanding those changes also grows gradually. There is rarely one discovery that answers everything. Instead, knowledge advances through hundreds of careful observations that strengthen or correct one another over time. This is one reason the story of the drowned coast is so valuable. It teaches patience. It reminds us that uncertainty is not weakness but honesty. Saying, "we do not yet know," is often the most accurate conclusion available. 2. Human origins deserve that honesty because the people who lived through those ancient changes were real human beings, not characters created to satisfy modern curiosity. Their lives deserve to be described only as far as the evidence reasonably allows. At the same time, those lives remind us that ordinary experience has always mattered. A changing shoreline, a familiar path becoming impassable, a spring turning salty, a camp moving inland, children learning a new route instead of an old one. These quiet adjustments are as much a part of history as any famous monument or written chronicle. The ocean did not simply hide archaeological sites. It hid countless ordinary decisions that allowed generation after generation to continue living despite an environment that never stopped changing. Perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all. Human history has never been a story of perfect knowledge preserved forever. It has always been a conversation between memory and forgetting, between preservation and loss, between landscapes that remain and landscapes that quietly disappear. The sea reminds us that the earliest pages of our story were written on a living planet, and living planets continue to rewrite their own surfaces. Our task is not to recover every missing word, because that may never be possible. Our task is to read the surviving words with care, to respect the silence where the pages are gone, and to remember that even an incomplete history can still reveal something profoundly true about what it has always meant to be human. The last truth of the drowned coast is not that the first chapter of human history is gone forever. It is that it became harder to read than we once imagined. Some parts were destroyed, some were scattered, some were buried under mud, sand, and shallow seas. Some may still be waiting in places we have not yet searched carefully enough. Some may never return to knowledge at all. This is not unusual in deep history. It is the condition of deep history. The farther we look back, the more the record becomes shaped by accident, chemistry, erosion, burial, and the changing face of the earth. Yet the missing pieces do not make the story meaningless. They make it more human. A complete record would almost be too clean for the lives it describes. Ancient people did not live in straight lines or perfect layers. They lived in weather, hunger, movement, fear, memory, and care. They made choices in landscapes that were always changing, and some of those landscapes changed so much that they no longer exist above water. The ocean, by covering old coastal plains, reminds us that human history began on a planet that was never still. The shore moved. Rivers changed their mouths. Wetlands appeared and disappeared. Islands became separated. Paths narrowed. Camps shifted inland. Older memories became stories of places the young could no longer reach. Through all of that, people continued to live. That continuity may be the quiet message at the center of this whole story. The ocean may have hidden part of the first chapter, but it did not stop the human story. It forced movement, adaptation, forgetting, and remembering. It turned some landscapes into seabeds and some memories into fragments. It left later generations with an incomplete inheritance. But incompleteness is not failure. It is a reminder that every human life has always depended on conditions larger than itself. Our ancestors were not masters of the earth. They were listeners, walkers, gatherers, watchers of water and wind. They survived by noticing what changed, and by passing that knowledge forward before it vanished. This is why the drowned coast has value beyond archaeology. It teaches us humility. It teaches us not to confuse what survives with all that mattered. It teaches us that ordinary people, living in ordinary places, can be central to history even when they leave almost nothing behind. A child learning the tide, an elder remembering a vanished path, a group moving the fire higher above the beach, a family leaving a camp before the water reached it. These small acts may never become famous evidence, but they belong to the long foundation of being human. The first chapter was not only about where people went, it was about how they learned to remain alive in a world that did not promise permanence. When we look at the sea now, we may see calm water, waves, a horizon, and a modern coast that feels fixed. But beneath that surface may lie old ground, old rivers, old crossings, old shorelines, and perhaps the faint traces of human lives that once seemed as present and ordinary as ours. We do not need to invent a lost civilization to feel the weight of that. The truth is already large enough. The ocean covered parts of the human beginning, and because of that, we must read the past with patience, caution, and respect for silence. What remains can teach us. What is missing can also teach us. Together, they show that history is not a perfect archive, but a fragile conversation between memory and the earth. And maybe that is where this story should rest for now, not with a final answer, but with a quieter awareness that the first chapter of human history may still be there in pieces, beneath the water, beneath the sediment, beneath the limits of what we can prove. So when the tide moves across the shore tonight, and the water smooths away the marks left in the sand, it leaves one question open for us to carry. If the ocean deleted the first chapter of human history, how much of ourselves are we still learning to read from what remains?